Good morning. My name is Mark Wedig. I'm a friar from our province, and I live in Miami. I'm at Barry University. I've worked with and for the Adrian Dominican Sisters for 30 years. I'm here to moderate this session this morning. This session, which is St. Martin and St. Rose, our brother and our sister in mission. This session allows us to get a glimpse of the lives of both Rose and Martin. And Jennie Weiss Block, and Brian Pierce are going to deliver this session to us, and I have the pleasure of introducing the two of them to you. Brian Pierce is a Dominican friar of the province of Martin de Porres. Brian was a part of a team in the 1990s of friars that were sent to create a community in Honduras. He returned to the U.S. to live for a year and a half in the Forest of Peace Contemplative Ashram in Oklahoma, where he began to delve more deeply into Christian mysticism and interreligious dialogue. Brian returned to Latin America, to Peru, for 3 years to minister to the Dominican family throughout Latin America and the Caribbean, followed by 6 years based in Rome, accompanying the Dominican contemplative nuns worldwide. Brian is now an itinerant preacher based in Texas. He has written 3 books in English: Martin de Porres, A Saint of the Americas, We Walk the Path Together, Learning for Khan and Meister Eckhart, and Jesus, the Prodigal Son, his most recent book, out by Orbis Press, 2016. Brian has also written a Spanish preaching manual entitled Praxis y Predicación. Jennie Weiss Block. Jennie, if you're good, I'm going to take all the credit. It's bad. It's your doing. So anyway, Jennie Weiss Block is a practical theologian and Dominican laywoman and member of the province of Martin de Porres. She has served as chief advisor to Dr. Paul Farmer since 2009 and was his chief of staff in his role as the United Nations Deputy Special Envoy under President Clinton. Working closely with Dr. Farmer, Dr. Block assisted in the relief and recovery efforts in Haiti following the 2010 earthquake, including the creation of a center for displaced and orphaned children. She is the co-editor of In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Dr. Paul Farmer and Gustavo Gutierrez. Dr. Block has an MBA, an MA in theology, and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Barry University. She is the author of Copious Hosting, A Theology of Access for People with Disabilities, Continuum Press, and she is also that book is considered a seminal text in the development of a theology of disability. At Barry University, she was the founding director of the Center for Dominican Studies and has served as an adjunct professor there. She lives in Miami and in New York and is the mother of 3 children and 3 grandchildren. So I introduce you our 2 speakers today.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
In 1579, a mulatto child named Martin de Porres was born into very humble conditions in Lima, Peru. Like many people in the complicated world of conquest and colonialism, Martin was born already marginalized by the simple fact that he was poor and of mixed blood, part African and part Spaniard. Martin's baptismal record reads, "On Wednesday, the 9th of December, 1579, I baptized Martin, son of an unknown father, and of Ana Velázquez, a freed black woman." With just these few words, we already get a glimpse of the early life of Martin de Porres. Author Alex Garcia Rivera says that by refusing to take responsibility for his new son's birth, Juan de Porres condemned his son to illegitimacy, a serious consequence in the strictly hierarchical society of Lima. So Martin, as we can see, came into this world already marked by suffering. He knew alienation from a very young age. But what is astounding about this patron of ours, our brother, is to watch how Martin slowly, little by little, transforms that suffering into a life of unbelievable compassion. For us Dominicans, there's a double blessing in this grace-filled story, and it is that just 6 years after Martin's birth, in a house a block away from where he was born, a little girl was born to a well-off family of Lima's aristocracy. Her name was Rosa de Santa Maria, better known to us as Rose of Lima. Rose, who would become the first canonized saint of the Americas, was baptized in the very same baptismal font as her neighbor Martin, and by the same diocesan priest. Rose and Martin were born from the same baptismal waters as friends for eternity. And if those blessed coincidences were not enough for us to suspect God's providence at work here, we also know that as adults, Martin and Rose would have seen each other frequently at Mass at the Dominican Priory, just a few blocks from Rose's home. Please don't laugh, I'm not an artist. Up on the right-hand side, it says the home and gardens of the Flores family. That's the home where Rose was born. And literally, crossing the street is the house where Martin was born. Both of these places are still standing today. Catty corner on the same block is the church of San Sebastian, where both of them were baptized. About 4 blocks from Rose's house coming down the same street is the Priory and Church of Santo Domingo in Lima. And about 6 or 8 blocks from Santo Domingo is the other Dominican priory, La Recoleta, where Juan Macias lived his Dominican life. So within a few blocks, Martin and Rose were born. Rose lived her life in this area. Martin entered the priory of Santo Domingo, and Juan Macias, a few blocks down the road, entered the priory of La Recoleta. It was destined to be Dominican blessing upon blessing upon blessing. These 3 became friends. And not only friends, but they were the friends of God. Dominicans, helping us today learn to live the Holy Preaching.
"55 years after dozens of roses miraculously tumbled out of Juan Diego's cape in the middle of winter, this lovely flower would again take on symbolic meaning in Christian history with the birth of a child who would be called Rose and known to many as the Redeemer of the Americas. One of 11 children born to Gaspar de Flores and Maria de Olivia Flores, at birth, she was named Isabel after her maternal grandmother. It seems baby Isabel was God's little special child right from the start. For as legend has it, her mother experienced no pain in childbirth. Having given birth myself, I can attest, this is reason enough alone for her to have been her mother's favorite child. There are several accounts for how the child's name was changed to Rose. The one most often given is as follows. A household servant, probably a young indigenous woman, went to check on the baby lying peacefully in her cradle. Peering into the cradle, she lets out a startled cry. Everyone in the room rushes over to see what's happening, and lo and behold, as the baby's mother explains, some 33 years later, when testifying at her daughter's canonization process, the baby was so beautiful, it seems her whole face was made into a very pretty rose. And in the middle, we could see the features of her eyes, her mouth, her nose, and her ears. It lasted only a second, but left her face even more beautiful than it had been before. And from that moment on, she would be called Rose. Now, this is a stained glass window that has Rose, Martin, and Juan Macias that hangs in the Dominican church. And this is my favorite image of Rose. And this is done by Cristobal Torres, and it's a window at a small children's orphanage in Haiti. And on the grounds there's a little chapel, the St. Rose of Lima Chapel. And I have particular attachment to this picture. Is Cristobal here? Because he used my daughter as the model. And her birthday is the Feast of Rose of Lima. And my granddaughter was actually born on Rose's birthday, April the 20th. Now, little Rose was a quirky child with a vivid religious imagination. Something here probably many people can relate to. She was a beautiful child with uncommon looks in their region, blonde hair, fair skin, and rosy cheeks. She was said to be very sweet, very quick, and very determined. It's often said that Rose came from a very wealthy family, but one biographer puts it this way. Her family was more distinguished by birth than by fortune. And so while the whole family enjoyed social standing and were very respected in the community, their finances went down rather than up during Rose's life, and this often created a lot of stress in the household. Two key experiences marked Rose's childhood. First, when Rose was about 5 years old, her grandmother read her a book about Catherine of Siena. This encounter with the medieval mystic would chart the course of Rose's spirituality for the rest of her life. She began to call Catherine her mistress and set out to emulate her in all things. Inspired by what Catherine did as a child, when Rose was 6 years old, she sought out a priest and told him she wanted to take a vow of virginity and dedicate her life to God. As hard as this is to believe, the priest actually agreed to let the little 6-year-old girl take a vow of virginity. However, he instructed her not to tell anyone till she was much older. I'm relieved to report that the priest was a Jesuit. The other experience that marked her childhood was a difficult and tumultuous relationship with her mother. Rose's biographers do not treat her mother kindly, referring to her as difficult, ill-tempered, and disagreeable. I'm going to defend Mom a little, as she did have 11 children, limited financial resources, and truth be told, I don't think her little Rose was an easy child to raise. For starters, from the time Rose took her private vow of virginity at 6, her aspirations for herself were in complete conflict with her mother's aspirations for her. Her mother delighted in her beauty and was always attempting to dress her in fancy clothes and curl her blonde hair and show her off to family and friends. For years, there were constant arguments about dress and cosmetics. As she grew to a young woman, the tension only increased, as her mother had high hopes that Rose would marry well. The emphasis on her beauty and appearance created terrible problems for Rose, and in turn she chopped our hair off, she put pepper on her face and dirt on her clothes, and was flat out rude to any potential suitor. As she began to engage in penitential practices, this understandably gave her mother great concern. To cope with the demands her mother placed on her, Rose developed a very unhealthy pattern that facilitated between feigned obedience and outright defiance. But despite the difficulties with her mother, Rose nonetheless had a very stable and safe childhood where all of her material needs were met. She seemed to have a good relationship with her father, although he was gone a good bit and left the raising of the children to his wife. She enjoyed very close relationships with her siblings. She doted on the little ones and was very close to an older brother who tried to understand her attraction to the spiritual life and helped her build a hermitage in their yard, just like Catherine of Siena stands today. I took that picture myself. When Rose was about 12, her 14-year-old sister Mercedes took ill and died quickly. Rose was heartbroken, and this loss drove her more deeply into the spiritual life as she sought comfort and explanation. She was only 31 when she died. Both of her parents and 9 siblings were still alive, and surely this death left a terrible void in their family.
Martin's upbringing was pretty complicated. His mother, Anna, originally from Panama, had been born a slave. It was she who took Martin to the church of San Sebastian on that ordinary December day back in 1879, where with the support of his godparents, Martin was reborn in the waters of baptism. No one ever imagined that little Martin would one day become one of the most beloved saints of our church. His mother, of course, didn't have much time to think about saintly things in those days. On that day, she took him to be baptized. The harsh reality of becoming an unwed, single mother must have kept her quite occupied and preoccupied. The fact that his mother entered this world as a slave is a significant piece of our story. The Peru that Martin and Rose grew up in was born from a clash of very different worlds. Spanish conquistadors on this side, violence, conquest, conquered Indians, enslaved Africans, etc., etc. It was a world that was quite difficult. Bartolomé de las Casas, our great preacher of the 1500s, described the people of those days as a people beaten and crucified. What for others would have slowly turned into a life of bitterness and anger, for Martin it became an opportunity for holiness. An amazing life of holiness. He entrusted the chaos, the poverty, the surroundings, the difficult story of his own life. He entrusted it to God. And God somehow, in a miraculous way, took those African threads and those Spanish threads and blended them together into a beautiful tapestry of love. There these were pretty challenging times, we have to remember. The indigenous peoples and the African slaves being brought from Africa were living in a complete hell, we might say. Our brother Bartolomé de las Casas, writing around in these very same times a little bit earlier, had at one point, and this is tough for us to hear, Las Casas at one point had thought that maybe if a small number of African slaves were brought to the Americas, maybe that would keep the indigenous peoples of the Americas from being completely wiped out through genocide. Las Casas had barely made that possible proposal when he realized what a mess he had gotten himself into. Cyprian Davis, who's an African-American historian here in the United States, Catholic Benedictine, wrote the following. He said, in the 16th century, a Spaniard would have believed that a war with Muslims was always justified. Here we are again. Black Africans were seen as inhabitants of Muslim territory. Therefore, they could be enslaved. Thanks be to God, though, Bartolomé de las Casas came to his senses. This awakening to the truth led Las Casas to confess publicly that he was not sure that God would be able to forgive him for such blindness. Sadly, much of the slave trade had already been fulfilled. But Las Casas, at this point in his life, when he realized what a big mistake he had made by suggesting this possibility, sat down and wrote 11 new chapters to his History of the Indies toward the end of his life, categorically saying that any trade of African slaves was diabolical. Those 11 chapters that Bartolomé de las Casas wrote at the end of his life and added to his History of the Indies were not made public, were not put into any kind of written form until 300 years after his death. So for 300 years, Las Casas' 11 chapters against African slavery were never seen. We give thanks that Las Casas did finally see the truth and did, as a good Dominican, recognize his error and preach the truth. This is the very difficult world that Martin was born into. A world not so unlike our own. Though his father did pop in and out a few times in the early years of his life, his father was pretty much basically absent from Martin's growing up. When Martin was 8 years old, his father did take him and entrust him to a woman named Isabel Garcia, who lived in the neighborhood of Malambo. On our map a few minutes ago, it was the neighborhood off to the other side. Malambo was the African neighborhood on the outskirts of the small city of Lima at that time. And in Malambo, where Martin began to live and lived there for 8 years with this Mrs. Garcia, it was the same neighborhood where they had the corralones. And the corralones were fenced-in prisons where African slaves were kept until someone came to buy them. So for 8 years, Martin lived in the same neighborhood with Mrs. Garcia, in the same neighborhood where people of the same color as him were caged, waiting to be bought. We can only imagine how this impressed this young boy. He would have been 9 or 10 at the time. One can only imagine Martin passing by these caged human beings, men, women, and children, living like animals waiting to be slaughtered. Despite being surrounded though by this human slavery and suffering, those years with Mrs. Garcia ended up being pivotal years for Martin, opening him up to a life of compassion. He saw that suffering with his own eyes and would spend the rest of his life fighting it.
Rose was a prominent figure in the Beata movement, where she was part of a large active group of penitential female mystics. Highly esteemed in colonial Peru, these women created a hybrid existence for themselves, straddling the sacred and the secular. Living in their own homes, most bore a habit and were affiliated with one of the many religious orders that had come to Lima to convert the New World. They were known for their highly developed spiritual lives, their good works with the poor, and many sought them out for spiritual direction. While respected and followed by the people, these women were sometimes a concern to the church hierarchy, as they were difficult to control and monitor. Glad the bishop's not here. I want to touch a bit on Rose's asceticism, as this is perhaps the best known and most controversial aspect of her life. As is widely known, she engaged in very severe penitential practices. These are, of course, practices of another time and place, and it should be noted these were common practices. So much so, one biographer said that after Rose's death, all of the stores sold out of hair shirts and chains. As bizarre as these practices seem to us, and in reality are, I think we need to go carefully as we interpret the wider topic of penitential practice and Rose's behavior in particular. Our modern thinking, heavily influenced by the relatively new discipline of psychology, often turns to contemporary psychological labels, schizophrenic, delusional, psychotic, anorexic, to interpret these actions. And while, of course, there are correlations in behavior patterns, I think there's something important here that we don't want to miss or ignore. And this is to consider what Rose believed she was doing and why. Her extreme practices of self-denial and mortification were born out of an intense spirituality rooted in the idea that the quickest path to intimate union with God is to emulate the suffering of Christ and bind oneself as fully as humanly possible to the crucified one. This kind of spirituality is an encounter with a dangerous and undomesticated God that leads to a visual, passionate, and yes, sometimes mystical experience. Now, I know a spirituality that meets up with suffering sounds really strange in a culture where be good to yourself is a common mantra. And narcissism and unrestrained self-involvement do everything possible to make sure we never have to turn our gaze on the suffering of others. And we think Rose is crazy. For those who take the Christian life seriously, Rose's mysticism begs that we consider the question of just what kind of God we are going to encounter in our own spiritual practices. Of course, the test of any and all spiritual practices, be they penitential or otherwise, are their fruits. And if they do not lead us into a life of love and communion with others, then they ring hollow. In the case of both Rose and Martin, we can say with certainty that their spiritual practices filled their hearts with compassion and guided them into solidarity and service to their brothers and sisters. Now, this is a picture of Rose, which I own, hangs in my house, and in her sort of mystical beata state.
One day when Martin was probably 9 or 10 years old, when he was living with Senora Garcia in this Malambo neighborhood, one day Martin asked Mrs. Garcia for a stub of a candle. She wasn't quite sure why this kid would want a stub of a candle, but she gave him one of the leftover stubs. A few days later, Martin came and asked her again, and again, and again. She started getting a little worried about maybe the house was going to be burnt down one of these days. So one night, Senora Garcia and her daughter sneaked over to the room where Martin lived in their house and peered through a crack on the door. What Mrs. Garcia saw not only surprised her, but deeply moved her. Martin was on his knees, silently praying before an image of the crucified Christ, illumined by this small, flickering candle. A few nights later, Mrs. Garcia and Francisco went again, and there was Martin again. The little stub of the candle burning, and Martin on his knees before Christ. He was only about 9 or 10 at the time, but there he was, his dark silhouette piously illumined by the glow of that candle, listening to a voice that was calling him from deep, deep within. It was during these same years when he lived with Senora Garcia that Martin was introduced to the world of healing. Mrs. Garcia's daughter married a man by the name of Mateo Pastor, who was an herbalist, what we might call today a naturopath or something like that. He mixed herbs and did healings. So Martin was taken under the care of Mateo Pastor and began to learn this world of herbal medicine. He discovered little by little that he had gifts for healing, not only of the body, but of the soul and the spirit as well. He grew into this awareness that he was being used as an instrument of God for healing people. And he would often say to people who would come and be healed through his herbs and his prayers, he would say to them, I can help to cure you, but God is the one who will heal you. It was probably no surprise at all then when Martin, about at the age of 15, went to Mrs. Garcia. Her home was about 5 blocks from the Dominican Priory. Martin went to Senora Garcia and told her that the bells that he heard ringing each day from the priory a few blocks down the road were calling him to a new way of life. He thanked Mrs. Garcia for being his mother for a few years, and then Martin set off and asked to be a brother in the convento de Nuestra Señora del Rosario in Lima. And he asked to be a donado. We don't really have a word for that, but it's a lay brother who does not take vows. And the habit that Martin wore was the habit of the donado brothers. So at age 15, Martin enters the community at the Priory in Lima and begins his life as a Dominican.
Some sources say that Rose and Martin at least knew of each other as children, but it's likely their relationship began to seriously develop when Rose was about 13 or 14 years old. Martin was 6 years older than Rose, so he would have been about 20. He had entered the Dominicans 3 years earlier, completed his apprenticeship in barbering and medicine, and was already developing a reputation as a healer all over the city. They would have met at the Dominican church in Priory, where Martin lived and where Rose went every day, for she now had received permission to be a daily communicant. Given their great difference in social status, their relationship would only have been possible in the context of religious life, and the Dominicans offered them both a place in the church and a social location for their friendship. Initially, Martin was hesitant with Rose, given who she was, but over time, a deep and trusting friendship developed, and he affectionately called her the very familiar Rosita. Their friendship would have been a great gift, as they were able to speak to each other with honesty and openness, and share the struggles and complexities of their very different lives. Rose was growing medicinal herbs in her garden, and her father promised her that she could give half of them away to the poor. So she enlisted Martin's help in distributing the herbs. But then she wanted to do more, and she asked Martin to teach her how to administer medical care. So he shared his books, and he taught her what he had learned in his training. He no doubt encouraged and nurtured her vocation to the Dominicans, and at the age of 20, she would take the Dominican habit. No doubt Martin was present on that great day that she joined the order. Now, the city's main hospital was located right in back of Rose's family home, and she would often see the poor, mostly black slaves and indigenous people, being turned away. She would be so upset that she would go out into the streets trying to find medicine and food and housing for them, and using her family's limited resources to pay for these things. Finally, in frustration, her mother gave her permission to bring sick people home, and her parents gave her a room in the house, in their home, to set up a clinic. And this is the actual room where they ministered together. Rose was thrilled, and with the help of her great friend Martin, they ministered to Lima's outcast and poorest people. Along with food and shelter, Martin and Rose treated all kinds of ailments. These are the actual vessels that they used. They nursed tenderly, humbly made beds, washed clothes, dressed ulcers, and binded wounds, seeing their beloved Christ in each person. Rose's mother marveled at how Rose handled the terrible smells of the many people that came to her. But she still often fussed at Rose when the place was overrun with people. They say that Rose was never happier than when every bed was filled.
Shortly after entering the priory, Martin was assigned as the assistant infirmarian, spending many a night caring for a sick friar, a poor person wounded in a fight, or a sick dog picked up from the street. One of his Dominican brothers commented that Martin slept wherever the night found him, on a bench, in the chapter hall, or at the bedside of one of his patients. The image of Martin faithfully standing watch over the sick late into the night brings to mind the gospel mandate of Jesus, who said, "I was sick, and you cared for me." Martin, who had been loved into wholeness by God, wanted nothing more than to pass that same healing love on to others. Using that wisdom that he had learned from his mentor, Mateo Pastor, Martin mixed ancient African wisdom and indigenous herbs and his deep faith in Christ, transforming him into a much sought-after holistic healer. A man who, like Jesus, was concerned with the well-being of body, mind, and soul. One of his brothers said Martin served the sick on his knees, taking care of them throughout the night, 1 or 2 weeks at a time, according to each one's needs. He lifted them up, helped them lie down, washed them, even those with the most awful infirmities. His heart aflame like that of an angel. Martin was so loved and so respected by the community that they eventually begged him to make his religious profession. Remember, he entered as a donado without a profession. They wanted him to be a friar, a brother. Martin accepted in obedience, though he said, "I will never take off the donado habit. I will be a donado for all my life."
I visited Rose's house in Lima a few years ago with a group of Dominicans. A very nice Dominican sister showed us the house and the grounds and Rose's hermitage, and then took us to a lovely little museum and showed us a portrait of Rose done at the time of her death, which is said to be the image closest to what she actually looked like. Sister pointed out a handwritten note in one of the cabinets and told us it was the only existing letter we have written by Rose. The note says, "Thank you for the chocolates. I have shared them with others." Now, we all thought the "thank you for the chocolate" note was charming. Of course, it reinforced a common profile of Rose that locates her as a product of her social class. And in many ways, this is accurate. She was gracious and well-mannered and well-spoken. She loved to garden and was known for growing beautiful flowers in every season. She could read and write. She played a musical instrument and sang. She loved poetry and was known throughout Lima for the beautiful needlework, which she often sold to help her family. However, while reading widely on Rose in preparation for this talk, I discovered the reason, perhaps, that we only have one existing letter from Rose. For in 1622, 5 years after Rose's death, the Inquisition confiscated all of Rose's papers and letters, including her many spiritual notebooks, and burned them. It's painful to consider what has been lost to us. Why did they do this? Even during Rose's lifetime, she and her followers and the other Beatas were considered suspect by the official church because of the fear that their presence and brand of spirituality offered the people a more direct access to God. They were often prosecuted for their intellectual activities, and Rose herself was called by the Inquisition in 1614. After questioning her at length several times and finding nothing unorthodox, she was not officially charged, although 2 of her closest friends were sanctioned and censured. One of Rose's main biographers described what happened at the time of Rose's death. The crowds were so great that they did not merely comprise of heads of families. The poor, the rich, priests, religious, secular, Spaniards, native Indians, black slaves, all entered into the confusion on the streets, surrounding and trying to touch her body. The court showed the same honors that they usually paid only to the viceroys of the country. Father Prior of the Dominican convent received the body, and it was placed in front of the statue of Mary in Rose's beloved chapel of the Rosary. However, bedlam broke out as people stormed the door of the church trying to get near Rose and touch her body. They had to change her habit 6 times as it was cut to pieces by mourners desperate for a relic. Finally, when the poor Father Prior, Tom, you can relate, could not restore order, the brothers moved her chapel into the private novitiate. But the people still managed to get in, even taking the dirt from the floor where her body lay. Within a year, every home in Lima and much of Peru had a picture of Rose, and she was already the saint of the people. Her canonization process was opened shortly after her death, and over 2 years, testimony was taken from 75 people. When it was completed, it was sent to Rome with the expectation it would soon be approved. It came as a big surprise to the Dominicans when the process grinded to a halt. It seemed there was a movement to suppress lay spirituality, to try to get to control of female sanctity, and to regulate the role of women, because it was thought that this kind of religiosity was threatening and detracting from the power of the institutional church. Rose's massive popularity was a perfect example of the problem at hand, and great lengths were taken to suppress the powerful devotional cult that had developed around her, and thus her canonization had to be blocked. Now, the fact that popular religiosity is sometimes threatening to the official church is not exactly breaking news, or a new phenomenon. However, it does add a new dimension to the traditional and prevailing narrative of Rose of Lima. It also helps to explain why the primary focus in her second canonization process, some 30 years later, focused heavily on her penitential practices and essentially left out any mention of her intellectual gifts and pursuits. The circumstances of Martin's birth, illegitimate and of mixed race, tend to make the sources of his oppression obvious. However, I've come to realize that Rose suffered from terrible oppression as well. She didn't have Martin's option of being slightly invisible, flying below the radar. She had social standing, prominent parents, stunning looks, and was by all accounts quite charming, along with all of the expectations and that come with these seemingly desirable attributes. Her oppression was of a different sort, based both in her gender and the limits placed on her personal agency, particularly in the area of her deep desire to define herself spiritually and intellectually.
Martin learned to look out at the world through the eyes of God. Probably in a way similar to our new saint, Mother Teresa of Calcutta did. Looking at the world with the eyes of God. Like Mother Teresa, Martin had learned very early on to trust this grace of God who can turn a life of suffering and misfortune into something beautiful for God. We can't but stand in awe as we look at this young man growing into holiness, into such a beautiful icon of human compassion and freedom. Martin's heart, like God's, seemed to reach out and embrace the whole world, leaving us today a powerful example of what it means to struggle with limitations and difficulties in our lives while giving God room to use us in ways that we would never have expected. In a talk given a couple years ago in Rome on the feast of St. Cajetan, which is a very popular feast in Argentina, Pope Francis from Rome sent greetings back to the people in Argentina on this feast day, Feast of St. Cajetan. This is a piece of his greetings to the people of Argentina. I don't know much about this feast, but I picked up in this piece from Pope Francis that it is a feast where people go through the streets and share things with the poor. So Pope Francis sends this greeting to the people of Argentina. Sometimes, he said, I ask a person, do you give alms to the poor on this feast day? Oh, yes, Father, of course we do. And when you give alms, do you look into the eyes of the people that you're giving the alms to? The response he puts is, oh, I don't know. I wasn't paying much attention. And Pope Francis goes on to say, then you didn't really meet that person. You just tossed the alms and kept on going. When you give alms, do you touch the hand of the person who's begging? Or do you just toss the coin to them? Oh, I usually just toss the coin. If you didn't touch the person, you didn't really meet him or her. Pope Francis poses some pretty challenging questions here in this dialogue. How easy it is to toss a coin to a poor person. Toss a bit of compassion to somebody hurting. One day, Martin entered into the refectory of the priory. And it just so happened that one of his brothers came behind him and gave this story in the process of his beatification. So Martin walks into the refectory, and he happens to look down on the floor, and he saw, it's a famous picture, he saw a cat and a dog eating together at the same plate of food. Up to that point, it's just a normal story. But then we're told by this brother who was behind Martin, Fernando Aragonés was his name, Brother Fernando's behind Martin, and he sees Martin all of a sudden look off to the side. And that's when Martin notices in the little hole in the wall of the refectory, the head of a little mouse sticking out. And Martin turns over to the mouse and he says, well, here's the dog and the cat over here, and the little mouse over here. And Martin says, don't be afraid, little one. Come and eat with the others. And Brother Fernando said, immediately the mouse scurried over, and there they were, 3 natural enemies eating together as friends. Martin saw the world through those kind of eyes. That was his contemplative life. How he looked at the world. How he looked at the world lovingly, compassionately. That day when he called forth for this little mouse to join the rest of the family, he was actually doing something very similar to what St. Dominic had done several hundred years before. When Dominic sat down and spent the whole night communing with the innkeeper who had gotten lost in the heresy, the Albigensian heresy. Dominic had invited this enemy to sit down and become friends. Pope Francis says to us, the Eucharist, and this was a kind of image of the Eucharist, Pope Francis says, the Eucharist is not a prize for the perfect. The Eucharist is a powerful medicine and nourishment for the weak. Martin calling the weakest of the 3 to the table.
Rose was said to have many spiritual gifts, prophecy, dramatic intercessory powers, both while alive and after she died. She was often referred to as the protector, and her biographies are filled with stories of the way she healed the sick, converted the worst of sinners, and transformed people with even the most difficult temperaments. And she changed circumstances for the good. My favorite story is one where Rose cures all of the mosquitoes to stop a plague. So I think the CDC wishes she was around now. But from my perspective, her greatest spiritual gift, and one certainly worth emulating, was an absolutely unshakable confidence that God would provide all things necessary in this life. She never wavered, never worried, never turned people away who needed assistance. There's a story of once when a poor woman came begging for clothes to cover her half-naked children. So Rose went and took her mother's best clothes without permission and gave it to the woman to use for fabric to make clothes for the children. When her mother comes home, her mother's furious and loses her temper and starts screaming at Rose. And Rose very calmly tells her that God gave her the thought that God would make a return for the cost of the cloak. And of course, the same day, a stranger appears and gives her mother 50 pieces of money. And 3 days later, their neighbor sends by a servant a piece of cloth large enough to make another cloak. And if that wasn't enough, the next day, the Dominican friars gave her mother bolts of serge, just to show that her mother would have even more than her charitable daughter had given to the poor.
In the final years of Martin's life, he used to love to go up into the hills on the outskirts of Lima with a very dear lay friend of his named Juan. Juan was a young man who had come to Peru with his father, who was part of the aristocracy. His father died soon after they arrived in Peru, and Juan was basically taken under Martin's wings, and he cared for him for several years until he grew up. Martin and Juan would go out into the hills outside of Lima, to the north of Lima, to this area called Amancay. And they used to always go following the celebration of the feast of St. John the Baptist. For Martin, it was a wonderful chance to get away for some much-needed solitude, as well as an opportunity to see these magnificent golden Amancay flowers in full blossom. Kind of like St. Francis, Martin had this wonderful love for creation, similar to his passion for animals. Both of these loves were deeply connected with his love for the poor and his passionate love for Jesus. On one occasion, while they were walking through the hills, he and Juan, Martin cut off a branch of a fig tree and carried it to the top of the hill, where he dug a little hole and planted it. 2 weeks later, he and Juan returned to the same spot. And Juan said, "Father, the fig tree that you planted 18 days ago is already budding." Juan, telling this story in the beatification process, said that Martin smiled and said to him, "Thanks be to God, for within 2 or 3 years it will bear fruit for the poor who pass by this way." For Martin, the earth was more than just a garden of plenty. It was God's garden, the garden called creation, the garden that belonged to everyone, especially the poor.
There's a tendency to reduce Rose to a beautiful, eccentric, and somewhat one-dimensional young woman. But she's far more complex because she has an adaptable identity that fills the needs of the diverse constituencies that claim her. For the people, she represents holiness and miraculous intercessions. For the region, a symbol of Creole nationalism. For the Lima Dominicans, a trophy and a triumph. For her mother, a big problem. For the official church of her time, a threat. For the other beatas, a role model. And for us, well, who is Rose? And what do Rose and her brother Martin say to us today? Well, first, if you find yourself in a situation of oppression or marginalization by certain circumstances in your life, Rose and Martin make it clear that it doesn't have to ruin things, that doesn't have the final word. For they found their freedom in God, in personal relationships, and in service to their brothers and sisters. Last week I had the privilege of being present for Father Bruno's keynote address at a preaching colloquium in St. Louis. And Father Bruno told us that preaching is not an activity. It's a school of evangelization. Neither Rose or Martin ever preached from the pulpit. Their status in the church would not have allowed it. But they intuitively understood that preaching is not an activity that one engages in occasionally, but a way of life, a school of evangelization where everybody is both teacher and student. 400 years later, Rose and Martin are still among the very best of teachers. For as we gather here today, they are still evangelizing us. Another question that was posed to Father Bruno was about relationships in the order. His answer was to say, we need each other to understand something of the gospel. And we need to talk to each other about God so we can become what we already are, brothers and sisters. Dominican life has always been a place where serious, gospel-centered, life-giving friendships flourish. Rose and Martin join Diana and Jordan, and Raymond and Catherine, and countless others in showing us a model for friendship in the order. We do need spiritual friendships to understand something of the gospel. They will call us to wholeness in Christ, and in turn make us better preachers. Our Holy Father Dominic was a pretty modest guy. His personal resources included one patch tunic, his virtue, a charismatic personality, strong organizational skills, and a kind of confidence that can only be understood in the context of his deep, abiding love of God, the church, and humanity. When he died 800 years ago on August 22nd, 1222, at the age of 51, he had already organized a religious order that had men and women thinking and living as Dominicans. I doubt whether he could have imagined what would ensue in the following 800 years. Thousands upon thousands of Dominican men and women from widely different backgrounds, including a tender-hearted mulatto barber and a gracious mystic from a good family, and all of us, finding an ecclesial home and a social location under the big umbrella of Dominican life. On her deathbed, Rose thanked Dominic for receiving her into his order. Today, Brian and I invite you to join us in echoing Martin and Rose's thanks to Dominic for receiving us into his order. Together, we humbly ask Dominic to help us be good preachers so we can give glory to God and bring honor to the order of preachers. To make sure that 800 years from now, Dominican men and women can gather, just like we do today, to give praise and thanks for the last 1,600 years of grace opportunity to preach the gospel for the salvation of souls. Thank you.
We have about 10 minutes that we can engage in further dialogue among our Dominican family, meaning all of us gathered here today. Perhaps some thoughts, ideas, questions, comments related to what both Brian and Jennie had to offer us in their portraits of Rose and Martin. Perhaps there are some questions. I'm here to help entertain those questions from each of you who would like to do so. Ken, if you could speak into the microphone.
The National Dominican Sisters have just opened up a new mission in Sittard in the Netherlands, and that city is dedicated to Rose of Lima, and I just wondered about the history of her cult and how she got from Lima to the Netherlands and became this famous personage in a very, kind of out of the way and far away place from where she grew up. Have any comments on that, Jennie?
Well, it was amazing because even after the time of her death and the suppression of the first suppression, when they suppressed her canonization, and the Dominicans opened it again, there were other reasons for the suppression as well, because the new pope had decided that they needed to wait 50 years after somebody had died in the interim of when they suppressed the first canonization. And so 30 years later, the Dominicans were pushing, and they finally took up the canonization again. But by then, she really, the sort of the cult of Rose had already spread way beyond Lima and Peru, but also through the Americas, and was starting to spread throughout Europe. So I don't think it's surprising. She's a very, very popular figure throughout the world, and that started many, many years ago. I don't think that's a new phenomenon at all.
Yes, my question is, I can see how Martin was not oppressed or suppressed by the people because he was healing the nobles also. They would start him out for his healing ability. Now, I understand that some of the documents for his canonization process were lost in the shipwrecks a few times. Had to be redone, and he just canonized 1964, right? Yeah, around there. So, what's the reason for such a long? Was he suppressed also, like Rose was? That's my thought in my head. Thank you.
I don't really know if there was a suppression period there, but I think it's probably not too surprising for us that a black brother would sort of be put on the to-do list in terms of canonization. So I think it's probably something more like that. We'll get to that as soon as we have some time. But just as Jennie has said, both of these people were immediately acclaimed in Lima and throughout Peru. Everyone in that time knew they were saints. It just took time for that to cross the ocean, I think. So.
Question regarding their relationship. I know that there is some talk that maybe they also had some interaction with Juan Macias since they were contemporaries. Is there any historical evidence about what that would have looked like?
One thing I can tell, and maybe Jennie has another story, but there are lots of stories told of Martin and Juan in the gardens of the Recoleta Priory, the other one that's about 7 blocks from Santo Domingo, walking through the gardens, and Martin would use the gardens of La Recoleta to grow his herbs. He probably grew some at Santo Domingo as well. But there's a lot of stories about Martin and Juan going through the garden, cutting herbs for Martin to take to make his homemade remedies. So it's a beautiful image of the two of them wandering through the cloister garden of the priory, getting their herbs so that they can go out and heal the world. So it's a great image. So yeah, there was a great friendship there. And as we pointed out with the map, Rose lived 4 blocks from Martin's Priory, and Juan lived about 7 blocks from Martin's Priory. So I guess the 3 of them probably went out for a cafe latte every once in a while.
That's part of the liberty of historical interpretation.
Geography.
We're always reminding our students that history is not about deciphering facts, but it's about the work of interpretation. So that gives some new meaning to it, okay? Any other questions, comments? From way in the back of the room.
I think between last night and today, I have to say, first of all, my heart is very changed by all that I've heard. And I teach natural family planning, and I didn't really think about this before, but my primary concern is the poor. And I think as Catholics, we have to get out of Satan's crosshairs the question of legal or illegal and heed the voice of our saints that have gone before us and be in adoration. And that the poor is definitely the gateway to our salvation, and they also represent by our actions of caring for them the most important evangelization we could ever do. So thank you.
Thank you. All right. Just a reminder to all of you that we have 2 sessions that are later on this morning, and then
4.
yes, we have 4 sessions, two time slots for us. But just to remind you, you get to go. There are 4 possible workshops, and you get to go to 2 because they're repeats. So the same 4 that are in this next session after our coffee break repeat again in the afternoon. So you get to go to 2. So you have to pick 2 out of the 4 that you're going to be a part of. Okay, so we now are going to have a coffee break, and we want to thank once again Brian and Jennie for such a wonderful
It worked out great. It was so fun.
Y'all were wonderful.
We were. Well, you know,